They say the Vikings feared nothing, but there was one punishment so terrifying that even the toughest warriors whispered about it in horror. A punishment that tore open not just the body, but the very soul. This was the blood eagle, and once you hear how it worked, you'll understand why it became a nightmare that still haunts us today. The Vikings are remembered for raiding, exploring, and ruling the seas. But behind their sagas of glory is a darker side, one filled with punishments meant to strike fear deep into anyone who dared to cross them. And none was worse than the blood eagle. Was it real? Was it a myth? And how did it even work? Today we are going to explore the gruesome world of this punishment, step by step, to see why it is called the worst Viking torture of all time. The Viking Age stretched from 793 to 1066 AD, when Scandinavian warriors carved out empires across Europe and beyond. Their reputation wasn't built on military victories alone. It was built on stories of what happened to those who crossed them. In Viking society, reputation meant everything. A man's name could outlive his body by centuries, sung in poems and carved in stone. Most Viking punishments were brutal but straightforward. Thieves lost their hands. Murderers faced execution or were declared outlaws, cast into the wilderness to survive alone. But for the worst offenders, for those who betrayed trust or insulted the gods, something far more terrible awaited. The blood eagle sits in that shadowy space between historical fact and dark mythology. The accounts we have were written decades or even centuries after the supposed events, by people who may never have witnessed such a thing themselves. This creates a fundamental question that historians still debate. Was this punishment ever actually carried out? Or was it a literary invention designed to make the Vikings seem more fearsome? The blood eagle was reserved for high-ranking enemies or traitors. It wasn't for common criminals. This punishment was meant for kings or leaders who had committed the most unforgivable offences. It served as both vengeance and ritual, a way to punish someone who had betrayed sacred trust or insulted the Norse gods. The descriptions that survive are extraordinarily detailed. The victim would be stripped and bound face down, their back fully exposed. The executioner would use a sharp seax, the single-edged knife that every Viking carried, to make precise cuts along either side of the spine. These weren't wild slashes, but carefully planned incisions designed to access the rib cage while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. The ribs would then be methodically severed from the backbone, one by one. The sound of breaking bone would fill the air as each rib was freed. Once separated, the ribs would be bent outward and upward, creating the grotesque impression of wings sprouting from the victim's back. The visual effect was said to resemble an eagle spreading its wings, hence the name of this terrible punishment. But the horror didn't end there. Some accounts describe the lungs being pulled out through the gaps created by the spread ribs and draped over them like bloody feathers. The lungs would still be attached and functioning, expanding and contracting as the victim struggled to breathe. Salt would be rubbed into the wounds, not merely for cruelty, but because it was believed to keep the victim conscious and aware for as long as possible. The entire procedure could take hours, during which the victim was expected to remain completely silent. The punishment wasn't just about physical agony. It was a test that would determine how the victim would be remembered for all eternity. In Viking culture, the manner of your death was as important as the deeds of your life. A warrior who died with a weapon in hand would feast in Valhalla. A coward who begged for mercy would be forgotten or, worse, remembered with eternal shame. If the victim screamed, cried out, or begged for their life, they would be branded a coward forever. Their name would become synonymous with weakness. Their family would carry that shame for generations. But if they endured the entire ordeal in stoic silence, showing no sign of pain or fear, they would earn a twisted form of respect. Even their enemies would honor their bravery. This psychological dimension transformed the blood eagle from simple torture into something far more complex. The Vikings believed that courage in death could actually change a person's fate in the afterlife. Even an enemy who died bravely might earn a place among the honored dead, while a coward would face eternal dishonor. What's significant is that these accounts always involve high-status victims. The blood eagle was never described as being used on common soldiers. It was reserved for those whose deaths needed to send the strongest possible message to the world. The blood eagle may have had deeper religious significance beyond simple revenge. The Vikings worshipped Odin, the All-Father, god of war, death, and wisdom. Eagles and ravens were sacred to Odin, serving as his eyes and messengers across the 9 worlds. Some scholars believe the blood eagle was actually a form of sacrifice to Odin, not just a method of execution. The elaborate ritual nature of the procedure supports this interpretation. Simple execution would have been much easier and quicker. But the blood eagle required skill, time, and ceremony. If it were a religious sacrifice, then the victim's suffering wasn't just punishment, but an offering to the gods. The wings created from the ribs might have been meant to symbolically transform the victim into one of Odin's sacred birds. The requirement for silence also fits Norse religious concepts. In their mythology, the gods themselves often endured great suffering without complaint. Odin hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain the knowledge of the runes. If a victim could endure the blood eagle without crying out, they were demonstrating godlike courage. Modern medical experts and historians are deeply divided about whether the blood eagle could have been performed as described. From an anatomical standpoint, the procedure presents serious challenges. Cutting through the thick muscles and ribs near the spine would cause massive blood loss and shock. The victim would likely lose consciousness or die long before the wings could be fully formed. However, other scholars point out that medieval people possessed extensive anatomical knowledge from butchering livestock and treating battle wounds. They might have known exactly how to perform such a procedure while keeping the victim alive longer than modern assumptions would suggest. The use of salt could have served dual purposes, causing additional pain while also acting as a primitive antiseptic. Some scholars argue that the original Old Norse descriptions were metaphorical rather than literal. The phrase, "to cut the eagle," might have meant carving an eagle symbol into the victim's back, not performing the full surgical procedure. Over centuries of retelling and translation, these metaphors could have been misunderstood and elaborated into the grotesque procedure we know today. Whether the blood eagle was real or mythical, its impact on history cannot be denied. The mere idea of such a punishment spread terror throughout medieval Europe. English chroniclers wrote about Viking brutality with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. This psychological warfare proved incredibly effective. The Vikings were often outnumbered by their enemies. But the Viking reputation for extreme violence made many opponents surrender without fighting. Why risk facing warriors who might subject you to the blood eagle when you could simply pay them to leave? The fear generated by stories like these became as powerful as any army. The tales also served to reinforce Viking cultural values. Young warriors hearing these stories would understand that courage in the face of death was the highest virtue, while cowardice brought eternal shame. The blood eagle became a test that few would ever face, but that all should be prepared to endure with honor if fate demanded it. Consider the scene as it might have unfolded. A captured king lies bound in the great hall of his own fortress, now filled with Viking warriors. Smoke from torches fills the air. Warriors form a circle, some chanting prayers to Odin, others watching in grim silence. The victim knows what awaits. The executioner approaches, sayax gleaming in the firelight. This isn't a moment of rage, but a solemn ritual carried out with religious precision. The blade touches skin, and the ceremony begins. Silence falls over the assembled warriors. Every eye fixes on the victim's face, watching for any sign of weakness. This is the essence of the blood eagle. It's not merely about death, but about how that death will be remembered. The image of ribs spread like wings, lungs rising and falling one last time, burns itself into the memory of every witness. Even if only a handful of people ever truly saw such a thing, the stories would spread across continents. So was the blood eagle real? The truth may never be known with certainty. Perhaps it was a ritual performed on rare occasions, reserved for the most hated enemies. Perhaps it was only a story that grew darker with each retelling. What remains undeniable is that it worked. The idea of the blood eagle alone was enough to terrify enemies and cement the Vikings' reputation as some of the most fearsome people in history. It represented everything that made Viking culture both fascinating and frightening. Their obsession with honor, their acceptance of extreme violence, and their belief that how you died mattered as much as how you lived. The blood eagle stands today not only as the worst punishment linked to the Vikings, but also as a symbol of how fear itself can be the sharpest weapon of all. 1,000 years later, we still talk about it, still debate its reality, still feel that cold dread when we consider what it might have been like. The blood eagle succeeded beyond its creator's wildest dreams, becoming not just a method of execution, but a legend that continues to haunt us across the centuries. Subscribe for more shocking stories from history's darkest corners, where truth and legend intertwine to create tales that still haunt us today.